Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session of our two-day event partnership between the World Bank and the Middle East Institute, exploring the roadmap for climate action in the Middle East and North Africa. This session is essentially a two-parter. We'll have our final panel, which will start momentarily. And then as soon as we're done the panel in this very same session, so you don't have to go anywhere, we'll transition to a few closing remarks and discuss next steps. You've seen me all 2 days, but just if you haven't, I'm Mohammed Mahmoud. I'm the director of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. And today's panel is focusing on enhancing climate resilience in urban environments, this particular panel. I'll briefly introduce our panelists today, and I apologize for brevity because all of you have extensive experience and backgrounds and very well accomplished in your fields, but I also really want to dive into the discussion. So I'll start with Aline Bousman, who's the co-director at CWAS. And she has a lot of experience and she has focused in the past on environmental business development and ecosystem support systems throughout the Middle East region. Next, we have Karim Al-Gindi, who is an urban sustainability and climate consultant. He's also a founder and coordinator of Carboon, which is basically an advocacy initiative promoting sustainability in the cities of the MENA region. And he's also a member of Climate and Water Program's non-resident scholar team. And then finally, we have Nuhat Tanay, who is a MENA regional representative and board member for Resurgence. And she also has extensive experience in applying urban resilience assessments in over 25 cities and a lot of applications experience in the MENA region. So with those brief introductions, I'd love to dive into our discussion. My goal really is to cover three sort of general areas associated with this idea of enhancing climate resilience in urban environments. And these are areas really connected to the roadmap to climate action that was discussed the first day by Adil Abbas from the World Bank. The first one of which is tackling this idea or exploring this idea of how do you promote climate smart urban development and planning, certainly meaning in the context of the Middle East. So, and as I ask questions, my goal is really to keep this interactive. I may pose a question to one of the panelists. If other panelists want to add on, absolutely feel free to jump on and interrupt, and we'll keep it as organic as possible. So maybe starting at a high level, Karim, I'll pose this question to you. What can you sort of, to paint the picture as we talk about climate resilience in urban areas, what are the unique types of challenges that cities, both in general and specifically in the MENA region really, will face with respect to climate change when we start looking further into the future in the next 10, 20, even 30 years?
Thank you, Mohammed. So the basic impacts of climate change on cities are not too dissimilar from the impacts on the region as a whole. There's a temperature increase, but that's specifically in inland cities, which are not moderated by water bodies as our coastal cities. So you get more hot days, more warm nights, and with the urban heat island, which could add up to 3 degrees Celsius, the temperature increases are significant and have to be dealt with. And on top of that, we have the wet bulb situation around the Gulf, which could lead to heat stress and could potentially lead to fatal levels of both temperature and humidity increases. In the context of cities, these things also lead to secondary impacts, which is increasing demand for electricity in order to provide cooling that will maintain these cities livable as temperatures do increase. And then we have the water impact, which is variable precipitation, more variable precipitation across the board, but also in the context of North Africa and in the Levant, will have less precipitation, maybe slightly more precipitation in the southeast of the Gulf, of the Arabian Peninsula and in the Gulf, but that's not significant increase. It's an increase from a really low baseline. And the secondary impact of these, especially the variability, would be more urban flooding, and again, in the context of cities. Sea level rise is quite a serious issue both for cities and for agricultural sector. But in the context of cities, that would affect coastal cities in the south of Iraq, in the Nile Delta, and in south of Tunisia, and potentially as sea levels do continue to increase, it will also affect the Gulf Coast.
Great, thank you. So that sets the stage in terms of what are the challenges for cities, and maybe let's start to shift towards what cities have either been doing or can do with respect to some of these climate change specific challenges. So Alina, I'll shift to you and kind of pose the question from your experience. You know, you've been involved with a lot of sort of urban level type of adaptation strategies and initiatives. What would you consider some of the climate smart urban approaches that cities are either already currently, things that are already currently in place that cities have kind of structured in to deal with climate change? And then what are things that maybe aren't in place today that cities could look to incorporate or to implement to address maybe climate related challenges that are either getting worse or maybe new climate related challenges compared to what the regions traditionally experienced in the past?
Sure, thank you, Mohammed. I try to give a bit of background before we maybe go into a specific action, and maybe a disclaimer. So I feel it's challenging to again talk about the entire region, and my experience is really more in the Middle East, which might not be comparable to a certain extent to other parts of the region. And from what I have seen, is that we have much more scattered activities than holistic strategies, and those strategies could be actually on a mitigation or an adaptation level. I do think cities, just because they're so condensed in terms of population, in terms of services, they could actually be a wonderful mitigation center, but I think that's not how they're often looked at or used yet. It's more very ad hoc, specific, scattered adaptation strategies when they need to come in because of an immediate need. And I think this has also a bit to do with how much awareness, motivation, solution and financing is there from the countries and from the cities to actually not only come up with strategies, but prioritize them and implement them. So just as an example, like last year, I met someone who's responsible for the environmental department of the municipality in Baghdad. And she told me she has a budget of $700 for the year. So I think that's quite representative of what the priority is, without blaming certain entities or people. I think that's just a sad reality in some countries where other priorities are more dominant, and that's maybe something to keep in mind. Now, in terms of those like activities that I've seen, I do think that there are initiatives by communities, by NGOs, by businesses that see an opportunity in that field, either an immediate need, but also an opportunity. And I think that's a mindset that is also not very common yet. When we talk about all these like strategies and adaptation, people think, okay, that's a lot of money. But essentially on the long term, it can be also very cost effective, and there can be gains and savings from that too, which I don't think we often account yet the returns on investment that are required. So I see them sometimes happening on the small scale, again, either by communities or by NGOs or by private businesses, but less on a really holistic municipal city level.
No, that's a great point. And I think both you and Kareem raised the point that the challenges are complex for cities, and the potential solutions themselves may evolve and become complex as well in response as these things change. Noha, if I could pull you in on this thread, and with your experience of assessments in terms of climate resilience for urban and cities, urban areas and cities across the region, are there particular strategies or approaches, Aline had sort of broadly discussed, do you feel have more merit than others in application? And the one that comes to mind may be expansion of, say, green infrastructure in a way to support sustainable development in a lot of the growing cities in the Middle East, both in terms of scale and size, physically and population.
Yes, sure, Mohammed. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to join the discussion today. And following up, as you mentioned, on Kareem giving us this, I would say, overview of the different challenges, and Aline speaking more on the city level kind of maybe fiscal constraints and issues around budgeting and capacities. You mentioned, Mohammed, expanding on green infrastructure. Definitely, that's one, or maybe a vital action that can be taken at the city level in terms of enhancing the city's resilient capacity, and it's a key, definitely, to its urban sustainability. Apologies, that's the bell ringing in the background. But at the same time, I believe that expanding green infrastructure might be one solution among a lot of others that we've seen, for example, in the World Bank, the roadmap for the MENA region that have been out recently. And there were a lot of, I would say, climate smart urban strategies that have been listed under maybe 4, let's say, key transformative areas of food systems, energy transition, resilient coastal economies, and sustainable finance. But I believe what still maybe is missing at the local level is issues around what do you mean exactly by smart? And I believe that it's very important that we define this understanding of smart from a city level and citizens also level. Because if we are to speak about data, then understanding smart from that dimension of developing infrastructural technology, maximizing that use of green infrastructure and expanding it in a way that can enable us to collect, aggregate, and analyze real-time data, but not only to look into it from a policy perspective or at the national level, but how can we really support communities' climate resilience? How can that data be well understood by the communities? How can that data be actually used in order to enhance their adaptation actions and improve also the city level actions when it comes into resilience, whether it's mitigation or adaptation levels? So I believe here that yes, solutions are there, but localizing those solutions and making sure that we have the right data, evidence-based data, in a way that is co-designed with the communities, and mostly the urban poor, in order to best utilize those solutions for their benefits.
Yes, I agree. I think in our discussion, when we talk about sort of the promotion of resilient or climate smart approaches for development and planning, it's sort of when we think of a city planning perspective, it's a long view, right? It's trying to put things in action now, create systems in place to deal with how do you adjust in the long term or midterm. Let me shift then to something more short term and an aspect of fundamental service or aspect that a city provides for its citizens, and this idea of public services, the various public services. And so if the large scale is sort of the long-term mechanisms, and now shifting to actual public services at the individual, maybe community or citizen level, how do we, the second sort of large thematic area I want to explore is how do we ensure that these public services remain uninterrupted and in a sense climate smart or resilient against these impacts that Kareem had posed in the front end. And so if we think about public services at the city level, and I'll pull back to you, Nuha, from your perspective, based on what we talked about in the challenges, at a public service level, which of those in cities will be significantly at risk? Do you anticipate due to some of these future impacts of climate change and ability of cities to provide these services. You know, I think of things like sanitation, wastewater management, water delivery, that type of thing. And obviously it's more than that, but I anticipate, and not to answer the question before I ask it, some are more vulnerable than others, and of course can depend on the impact in region, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
Sure. As you noted, Mohammed, we would anticipate usually, as maybe speaking from my own perspective as a planner or maybe a disaster specialist, we would think usually about waste management or maybe critical infrastructure when it comes into electricity or even the dependencies between the different types of infrastructure itself. But interestingly, Mohammed, what we've learned from projects that we have implemented in other parts, and apart from the MENA region, whether through urban resilience assessments that we have applied within cities in the region, or maybe speaking more about a technical model that I can maybe give an example on which is a project that researchers have implemented. It's called the Raja. And the Raja means bridge in Swahili, and also in Arabic, as you know, it means the temperature degree, interestingly. But what we try to understand here is actually how do we prioritize actions when it comes into which type of infrastructure within the city is to be prioritized in terms of whether investments or upgrading, or maybe even formalization when it comes into informal settings. And here we realize that before coming into that conclusion, there is a bigger gap that we need to fill in, which is data connectivity. And when we speak about data connectivity, we are actually here identifying the key stakeholders who actually whether provide that public service or make the benefit out of it. So it's going to be the city hall. We are speaking about, for example, the meteorological departments at the national level, and even the meteorological departments within the city authorities, maybe humanitarian response and representatives from the Red Cross and Red Crescents. It might be even the media, or maybe representatives from the community themselves. So this issue of data connectivity, what we try to focus here is actually building partnership to improve weather and climate information services, including early warnings for extreme weather events, but specifically for urban users. And here it's important to note that the Raja came as to develop a climate urban solution, not only for communities in response to humanitarian actions, and that's actually what we see with the existing solutions when it comes into climate financing, like, for example, forecast-based financing or disaster risk financing. What the Raja have tried to do is actually target the communities who are usually out of the radar of the humanitarian aid, people who are can be internally displaced populations or even refugees who are within our cities, but they are not well identified and literally out of the radar. So with that, and that's something that has been also very highly identified in a lot of the global agreements. For example, in the Paris Agreement, it goes into that balance between adaptation and mitigation for the communities in need, and looking into how much of that fund that is going to humanitarian aid is actually reaching to the communities and the I would say the urban poor. So with that model in the Raja, we managed by implementing it in different countries in the sub-Saharan Africa, including Kenya and Tanzania, to actually develop what we call a weather and climate information value chain that managed to underline or maybe tackle the underlying weather and climate information gaps within the communities, and build more of a co-designed solutions in participatory approach with the people in need and with the scientists, and filling that gap of data connectivity.
Great. You know, you touched on something I was actually going to go to next, and two things. One, I appreciate the example, actually concrete example of how a particular issue was addressed in the Daraja example that you provided. We also touched on one thing I also wanted to talk about, which is vulnerable communities, how there's sort of disproportionality on the impact of climate, certainly even within cities, whether it's the poor or those that, if you look at urban systems where some areas of the city have better connectivity to public services than others. And I know, Aline, that you've done some work where you, at a community level, have tried to implement some measure of climate resilient approaches or adaptation measures that I believe target a lot of these vulnerable populations. And I'd love to hear, just from your experience, some examples of those activities, much like Nuha shared.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm happy to give a couple of examples, but maybe to really understand the situation that we have in most cities in the region, we're talking about concrete stone deserts, unfortunately, if they're not lucky to have some partially polluted rivers or seashore next to them. So I think that's also the issue why they're so prone to the effects that Karim mentioned at the beginning. And which also means that the solutions are definitely needed in the field of water, energy, and then also other fields that are impacted by those. And we work with a lot of social businesses, most of them are local or regional, that are looking at where are opportunities to create impact, but also find a solution that is financially sustainable. If the service is not provided or cannot be provided by the public sector, I think it's absolutely fine that other parties are coming in and trying to complement that, and it's even needed. So we have businesses at different scales that are providing waste management solution, from collection to recycling to reuse for different waste streams, where, I mean, we see it everywhere. Most of the cities, they don't have, either they have almost none existing service in that field or only partial existing service. The same comes to or accounts for wastewater. Wastewater collection and treatment. We have social businesses that are providing wastewater treatment to schools, for example, that have high desludging costs because they're in the city, but they are not connected. And they're even willing to pay for it. And I think that's something to account for. We have businesses that are trying to grow water efficient crops space efficiently in cities. And there are people who are ready to pay a premium for it to make that feasible, because they want to be less dependent and they want to encourage alternative ways and resource efficient ways to food access. We have projects on fruit tree forests that are completely community-led, which are super long-term, super ambitious in terms of sustainability, not just from like the fruits itself, but this is basically a water storage, a natural water storage solution. We have other businesses in the field of transportation. So each one is looking into pockets, and each city has a different market situation where sometimes this works, sometimes doesn't work. Again, it's not very holistic. There's no top-down strategy behind it. It's very opportunity needs driven. It's great that we have that at least, but that cannot be everything. It just shows, I think, how big the need is. And that there is an opportunity in that need, because what they all have in common is that they think very circular. And the way the cities are right now is that their resource use is linear. So we take the resources, we use them, we dispose. And if a city is basically taking its energy, its nutrients, and it's recirculating it, there is so much less cost in terms of process adaptation, because you can account for the reuse, for the gains. I think then we look at it from a completely different angle. And this is what these small businesses are doing, because people have benefits and gains from it, or there are resources that can be reused again. So I think on a tiny scale, that kind of shows what could be done on a larger scale.
You know, after that, I was actually going to ask Karim a particular question, but now you've given me two other questions, so I'm not sure how to move forward here, Karim, but maybe I'll start with the first one. and kind of pull on a couple of the threads that Aline brought up, which is, so we've talked about constraints in terms of public services, and then just resource constraint and sort of the imbalance of vulnerability and access to these public services and resources in different parts of the city and different populations. I guess, Karim, one of the questions I'll pose is, in light of that, cities, in some cases, fairly get a bad rap of being a larger source of carbon emission and pollution. And so Aline kind of pulled on a thread on some ways that this whole idea of a circular process, what are feasible ways where cities can transition to being less, I guess, low carbon and low pollution compared to where they are today? And maybe pulling on the circular thread. I'm already thinking of applications there, but please share with us your thoughts.
Sure. Sure. Well, the idea that cities are bad is, I think, an idea that I entirely disagree with. I think cities are the best form of human settlement that we came up with, and they offer this amazing opportunity. We haven't used the opportunity to its fullest, but I can't see what we're comparing it to that is more efficient. So on that, that's on the one side here. What can cities do? There's plenty of cities could do to improve. On the context of the cities of the MENA region specifically, how do we transform them into more sustainable, more resilient? I think depends on our level of impact, the desired level of impact, and the amount of investment that we're willing to put into it. So on the one hand, there's the optimum version, which is city densification. You get to a city center, you densify, you turn it to transit-oriented development, you make it high density, you make it mixed use, you add public transportation. These tend to be the basics, the building blocks of the most sustainable city form. Of course, with green infrastructure weaved throughout that to encourage mobility and bikeability, etc. Having said that, that is also the most difficult thing to do because it's a really difficult retrofit. Anyone who works within cities understands that working in a new city is always much easier. Designing a new city is always much easier than retrofitting an existing city, and retrofitting an existing city center is much harder than anything else. So that's the one end of the spectrum, if you like. And there's also sort of a mid-spectrum effort that you could do, which is retrofitting existing buildings, designing all new buildings to reduce their need for cooling and for ventilation. That tends to be a building scale issue that could reduce carbon emissions and obviously other forms of pollution. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have a fairly relatively simple measure that you could do, which is transform existing mobility forms like internal combustion engine, private cars, into electric vehicles. Doesn't really require that much intervention. You need to develop charging infrastructure, for example, and you need to source that energy from sustainable energy sources, from renewables. So that tends to be one of the low-hanging fruit, if you like, hence the interest in governments around the world in doing that. It doesn't require building expensive infrastructure. You just need to, over time, transform your fleet from one form of private vehicles to another form of private vehicles. So if you could source the energy from renewable energy sources, then you've got that sector's energy and associated carbon emissions dealt with. And so we could go to a whole array. There's a menu of measures that you could do to improve a city's sustainability and, of course, its resilience to climate change impacts. But all really depends on how much we're willing to intervene and how many measures we're willing to integrate. And of course, how much money do we have for all of that?
Yeah. Financing is a big piece. Maybe I'll ask this and kind of have it an open question. Maybe dive a little bit into the details. To your point, there are things that or enhancements or improvements in efficiency within cities that can address resource issues absent even sort of the exacerbated impacts of climate change. Obviously, they become more necessary or needed in light of resource issues. And for me, the thing that jumps to my mind is water. So I guess maybe I'll ask, and maybe all of you can respond depending on your regional experiences of different parts of the Middle East, which is, putting aside the fact, yes, financing is going to be an issue for some countries more than others, but how feasible or how quick or how soon can we look at some of these efficiency or enhancement improvement approaches? So, for example, improving or sort of, as you said, retrofitting or improving conveyance systems that have significant water loss. And that's an issue in a lot of the cities in the Middle East, or some cities are experiencing it a lot worse than others. Improving water efficiency in terms of water reuse, water recycling, not just wastewater for non-potable uses, but taking that extra step of water treatment to drinking water standard. Are we there yet? Can we get there? How fast can we get there? It's really an open question. So whoever wants to take a bite of that, I'd be happy to hear.
I could chip in. There are easy sectors like water storage, for example. So because much of the impact of climate change on the region is relating to water storage becomes an easy way of adapting to the variability and the reduction in water availability. Energy storage, by the same token, could be something else that could be done. Stormwater management can also be adapted for water collection and can be used for landscape and agriculture irrigation as well, and as well as a whole bunch of other benefits that can be achieved from green infrastructure and other forms of stormwater management in order to reduce the risks of flooding associated with climate change. And then there's the idea of cities decentralizing their energy sources. If they're going to integrate renewables, they can do that in a more decentralized way, which provides the resilience necessary for disaster risk, and as well as transition from a mitigation point of view as well. So rooftop solar, for example, or community solar could be beneficial there. Urban agriculture, because of the risks to agriculture, especially in the Levant and in the Maghreb region in general, urban agriculture could help reduce the risk to food security that will happen as a result of both change in temperature and impacts on precipitation and rain-fed agriculture. So there's some of this that I think I can automatically see being implemented within the context of cities. There's more, so I'll leave that to colleagues to chip in.
Maybe I can add on this from a more management or regulatory perspective, because I think often it's not the lack of solutions or the concepts, but it is about understanding why sectors are run the way they are run currently and why we're not there where we could be. And for example, in terms of water efficiency in supply, but also in demand, most of the time, it's not a matter of technical solutions. So we have really high non-revenue water in most supply networks, which means that 40 to 60% of the water is not reaching those users. And it's not about just replacing the pipes. It's about how do we monitor, how do we manage it, how do we fix leakages, how do we incentivize performance on that. So some solutions are definitely technical, and sometimes networks are also very old and need to be replaced. But I do think there is we often have, unfortunately, a quite traditional mindset in these sectors, or we have a traditional way of funding it that is not helping to really move forward with innovative means to improve it or to increase performance, even though solutions could be there. Or we don't have we have maybe also a traditional way of funding it, which then causes to not really plan and account for the gains that could be done if we're actually maximizing the efficient use. So I do think, sometimes we need to look at why are certain policies or structures or funding schemes the way they are, and where are really the areas where we need to start, changing the mindsets or putting pressure or other incentives. So that's one. I think in terms of water reuse, maybe we don't need to look at Singapore as a benchmark, but even like finding other ways of reusing it within the city context. And this could be for green spaces. This could be also for other commercial or industrial uses. It doesn't have to be potable water. I think there are more feasible ways of making sure that potable water is saved for drinking water, fresh water is safe for that, and the reused water can be used for lots of other use purposes as well. But here, either from a regulatory point, there might be restrictions on it, or simply from linking sectors, there isn't yet enough done, or actually the allocating the priorities and spaces to use that within the borders of a city. It hasn't been there. So again, and this is often from a more managerial policy planning point of view than it's necessarily the individual actors themselves or the solutions, from what I've seen in our context.
Yeah. Nuha, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Yes, sure. Now just listening, to Karim and Elena, I think these thoughts really builds up into and just made me think about who are we actually talking about, who are the main actors in order for these solutions to take place that we really need to target in order to understand exactly the challenges that they are facing. And as we all agree that definitely not the entire region, because the region is extremely diverse, but we agree that these issues of, the limited fiscal transfers from the national to the local level, when it comes into climate finances, and even the autonomy that the local governments have when it comes into delivering and managing their urban services. But if we look into the end of the spectrum, when we speak about, for example, informality within our region and how these percentages are extremely high, if we only speak at water management and we look into it, and I'm just picking one of the examples that Karim have mentioned, for example, in water storage systems. In some of these areas, water connectivity for clean water does not exist. So they depend completely on potable water. That might be in triple or maybe 4 times the actual price for the water, but this is the actual reality of their lives. So if we are speaking about the citizen in such an area, I believe that collecting rainwater can be of a great resource for them, and to an extent that is just beyond what we can imagine. And we need to look into that actually the economic impact of it, in terms of access to water, the affordability of that water. So providing such solutions does really matter, but those solutions cannot take place unless the citizens themselves are aware of when the rain is going to come and what's the frequency of that rain in order for it to be collected. And at the same time, even for for example, the city leader or at the municipal level, for them to provide solutions, if they cannot see the long-term impact when it comes into the city, let's say the municipal revenues as well, you can't really find that shared solution. So I think that the key word here is ownership, understanding, having the data, and then having that ownership of the solutions. Then we can definitely overcome these issues of the financing. But without having that sense of understanding of the risk, how can it be solved, and the ownership of the solutions, I believe we are way behind.
Yeah. Now this is it's a perfect segue to what I want to explore next, and I'm glad you brought up the word ownership. It wasn't the word I had in mind, but I think it encapsulates what I want to posit to all of you, which is this idea. For the most part, we've been talking about addressing these urban city level issues kind of from the top down, right? The municipality level, maybe a utility level, a city management level, to provide services, to ensure resources for the communities that they serve. But you started to touch on an area that I think is interesting, which is ownership, maybe bottom up, right? And we've talked about, sort of in general sense, climate adaptation, and maybe specifically the water resources or energy, but at a citizen level. And in some cases, I think we heard an example in areas where they are challenged in terms of access to resource, or poverty, right? That's out of their control. And then there's other areas where parts of the cities where citizens have better access to resources and services. Can we talk about maybe examples, or whether things you have seen or participated in, or even sort of prospectively, how at this low community, not low, but the space community level, at the citizen level, how can they take ownership and maybe look within the community for ways to adapt to some of these challenges that aren't always contingent on the governance and municipality level, recognizing that municipality will deliver these resources, water, sanitation, etc. But what can be done that's in the power of the citizen level that can help in achieving a climate resilient and higher climate adaptation initiatives at that level? And I guess maybe Nuha will start and maybe go back the other way. Start with you.
Sure, Mohammed. I can give a very interesting example from the implementation of the Daraja model in Nairobi, in Kenya. And specifically, that was applied in one of the informal settlements in Kibera. And there, at the beginning of that project, we actually have applied a survey to look into the level of access for weather and climate information at the community level. And the responses came around, I would say, only 65% of the communities that have been surveyed actually had access to weather and climate information, or even trusted, because that's another issue when it comes into data. It's not all data that we have access to is actually data that is trusted, and we can really build actions when it comes into livelihoods and make decisions on. But in that case, we also tried to understand exactly, beyond the issue of access, is the element of preference. So for people, it's very important when we speak about such settings, is really to map the different livelihoods and understand the different context. We can't really generalize when it comes into understanding the different vulnerabilities and needs for people. So with preferences, we come to understand that people might receive information in different ways, some of them through radio, SMS, or even using WhatsApp messages. But even the access of information varies when it comes into income, household income, because when it comes, for example, into SMS messages, you need to have a specific payment for it. For WhatsApp, maybe people won't have access to their mobile data for more than maybe 10 or 1 hour a day. So even the access to information really had an impact into to what level they can take an action on. By understanding that context, we managed actually to develop the access to weather and climate information and help communities to take actions on it. And when I say actions like, for example, being able to clean out the drainage system within their informal settlements, being able to fix the roofs of the sheds and being able to be well prepared to the rainy season, even supporting their livelihoods and making decisions of whether they're going to sell maybe umbrellas or sell ice creams on that day, because it does really matter how the weather is going to work. And it does really matter when it comes into the generation of incomes. So with that access of information, we were able to see to what extent does it really affect the livelihoods of communities, and actually being able to establish what we call the community leaders who do receive the information from the scientists, from the Kenya Meteorological Department, and were able to translate those messages into easy text messages in the local languages for their local networks in order to deliver this information to them, not only for weather information at the monthly level, but also for weekly and daily services. So people were able to take more, I would say, resilient actions when it comes into climate and weather information. So this is an example that showcases how really the decentralization of data can really help build resilience for communities.
Great, thank you. Aline, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I find it very interesting what Nuha said, and I think it really builds a lot of awareness, and I think it's a very long-term important mission to do so. However, I think what we also need to think of is, what do people care about now, day to day? Yes, we need to build that awareness for environment, for climate change, for long-term sustainability. But most of the people right now in this region, they don't care about environmental values. I mean, just to be straightforward on that. People have different priorities, and I think that's completely fair. And that doesn't have to be it's not a bad thing if we know them, and if we know how to make use of that, so they could take an action, but maybe it's not for climate change, maybe it's because of convenience, or maybe it's because it relates to the health of their children, or because they can have savings, or because they can make money from it. So I think a lot of actions can be done by individuals or by community groups, if we actually understand what their benefit or their pain is at this point of time. And they might not do it for the big long-term picture, but if the action contributes, that doesn't really matter, if we can start getting it done, in my opinion. So if we really understand what people care most about, be it that they're afraid that the pollution will be hazardous to their children, or it can be really a convenience thing, or they could make money because they are saving or reselling something here. I think those are all like entry points to get a solution started and to get ownership, while at the same time we build a broader awareness on the topics, which I think we need to do in any case, but it might take too long. So we need to just leverage the immediate benefits that we see as well.
That's great. Karim, do you have a perspective on that sort of bottom-up approach?
I do actually have a pitch to make for green infrastructure, because I think green infrastructure is the most community-led measure that we could take in cities to improve adaptation and resilience, and it can also have some mitigation benefits as well, some sustainability benefits. And that's the reason this is the case, is because the green infrastructure tends to not require much integration with existing utilities, doesn't need to plug into any existing pipes or any existing cables that can exist in parallel to existing infrastructure, doesn't need to comply with obsolete standards that don't necessarily consider resilience or sustainability. And in my opinion, most importantly, the green infrastructure is easier to sell to communities because it has obvious local benefits, not just reducing carbon emissions, but you could clearly quantify some urban heat island effects. You'll tell your neighborhood that this is going to be cooler and we're going to have more outdoor comfort. It's going to be nicer outside. It can improve stormwater management if the area is prone to some flooding. We've seen great examples in a neighborhood in Jordan where small plots of land have been retrofitted with green infrastructure and landscaping that self-irrigates using rain. It can be even used for fruit production, so you can add that as an additional layer to it. Potentially can reduce pollution, at least there's a perception amongst communities that it can reduce pollution. And of course, it can create a wildlife habitat for the enjoyment of the neighborhood, and definitely for children who normally don't have access to that kind of thing in the region. And of course, everyone agrees in local communities that green infrastructure can provide all these social and psychological benefits, aesthetics, color, and placemaking, and things that sometimes people can't describe in the technical jargon, but certainly can feel. So from my perspective, I think some measures such as green infrastructure are no-brainers. They're fairly straightforward. Communities can do them. They don't need to consult with the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Water to develop a small green patch of land between a few houses, and it will clearly have benefits to those communities.
That's great. I think we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to transition to the last theme that I had in mind, which is drawing a distinction for cities or metropolitan urban areas that are coastal. versus those that are not. And you're all aware, quite a significant amount of cities in the MENA region are either coastal, directly coastal, or along a significant river body. It may not be directly on a literal coast. I guess, Karim, maybe I'll start with you. When we think of, if we parse out some of these challenges from at least initially the climate change level or projected climate impacts, what are some of the risks or distinctions we can draw between coastal cities with respect to some of the climate hazards that they could face and could impact their basically their operations and how they work? I mean, you'd mentioned some things at the front end related to sea level rise, and maybe we did or we didn't mention extreme weather, but can we draw a distinction and maybe in terms of vulnerability, in terms of where the difference lies between those two types of cities?
Sure. Coastal cities are more exposed, but a lot of cities in the region is quite coastal, actually, in terms of most cities, or half of the cities being located within 100 kilometers, 60 miles from a coastline. So sea level rise is serious. And some cities are also unique in that they're sandwiched between mountain ranges and coastlines. And you get that in Muscat, and you get that in Jeddah and other cities. And that they tend to be prone, if the climatic conditions support that, and they also tend to be prone to stormwater and flooding, basically, as the water rushes between the mountain and the sea on essentially impermeable surfaces, and as a result, the city does flood. So you get those situations as well. Coastal areas are also where some economic sectors are dependent. A lot of the tourism on which many cities in the region are dependent on coastal ecosystems. So corals, for example, in the Red Sea are pretty serious in terms of the economic development of a place like Egypt. Tourism in Egypt is dependent on what's called coral tourism. So as the corals bleach, and they haven't yet, they have been quite resilient compared to others around the world, but as they do bleach, as the temperature continues to rise, that will create additional strains on the economies. And unfortunately, those who live and those whose livelihoods are dependent on this, those who work within the tourism sector, for example, are crying out for help. They don't know how to respond to this. Just like the farmers don't know how to respond to the change in rainfall patterns or the change in temperature, and they don't know what crops to choose, and they need technical guidance on how to do that. The same way, those whose livelihoods are dependent on the health of certain ecosystems don't have the capacity to deal with the change in those ecosystems in order to maintain their own livelihood. So a lot of help would be required. But yes, absolutely, coastal cities are different, and their challenges are different. And I mentioned earlier on that inland cities tend to have higher temperature increases or projected temperature increases compared to coastal cities. So it's not just sea level rise. There's a lot more risk there.
Yeah. Nuha, if I can ask you, keeping with this train of thought on coastal cities and from your previous work, on the solution side, what Karim had started pulling on this thread. What is also unique there as we draw a distinction between inland versus coastal cities in terms of maybe opportunities that's available to coastal cities that isn't necessarily available to inland cities in addressing some of these climate impacts?
Sure. I think Karim have set the scene very well when it comes into the different, vulnerabilities and the levels of exposure, looking into, coastal cities and coastal economies versus inland. But I think when it comes into opportunities, I think it's really interesting if we can look into it from an angle of cities' competitiveness. And what type of opportunities that cities can bring in terms of, for example, jobs creation, in terms of, the tourism industries, for example, when we speak about coastal cities, but versus inland when it comes into different agricultural activities. And also not forgetting the element of connectivity between these cities, because when we speak about, for example, food systems and food security, value chain, we can't really speak about one and ignore the other. So looking into opportunities within cities, their competitiveness, but also looking beyond cities into cross-sectoral kind of opportunities that can be generated, and how best can that feed into the wider country level economies and industries.
Yeah, that's a good point, and we've kind of leaned heavy on urban and infrastructure and municipal, but we haven't really touched on agriculture, and that's not necessarily separate from cities, because as you said, there's intersectoral dependencies, right? The supply source, for example, the systems of food delivery and food security. I guess, Aline, I'll posit the last formal question to you. Maybe talk a little bit more about how, maybe from the urban perspective, how can we leverage some of those intersectoral relationships to improve the resilience of cities? When we talk about, say, the agricultural districts and the sort of food, water, energy nexus, how can we better improve the resilience of cities under climate change by also improving these other adjacent sectors like agriculture or even industry that are, they're not separate, they're connected, but in a way different?
Yeah, I think we have a huge potential to grow in that field. I don't think this has been tapped into. I mean, most of the countries in the region either they heavily rely on food imports, or the food production is not centered close to urban areas, but it's like spread or allocated to different parts of the country. So, and it does feel like many governments who kind of deprioritized the sector for a while are now reconsidering that this should be a strategic area to invest and prioritize in, also from a geostrategic point of view, and during times of COVID, I think we saw other reasons as well. I do believe that instead of only looking how can we maybe bring the agriculture produce in a country closer to the cities, how can really the cities, by being more circular, reduce the waste, but also increase the production at the same time. So I do think that if we look at the different resource streams, we have carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, organic waste, biosolids. We have all of that basically in the city, and we're not using or recirculating it. And just the cost of like using and transportation or disposal is more than what we can gain. So I think on a small scale, again, we see like practices that are making use of these methods of reusing waste, reusing water on site, producing space efficient, water efficient, accounting on like small transportation ways, which are also not just logistic costs, but environmentally more friendly, being more flexible in terms of which customers or communities to serve. So I do think there are lots of small ecosystems for such nexus opportunities that we already see, again, from a maybe small business community perspective, more than from a big strategic point of view. But I do feel it has been a bit more on the priorities since the last 1 or 2 years, at least in some countries in the region.
Great. I'm checking to see if we have any general Q&A, and I'm not seeing anything that hasn't been addressed. I guess I'll just maybe ask you all to provide any final thoughts or comments that you want to leave our audience with, and maybe I'll start with you, Karim, and provide any concluding remarks you'd like to share.
Sure. Cities are where the climate battles will be won or lost. And because they're very complicated, we have to play by the city's rules. And the city's rules means that everything is connected to almost everything. And that is what makes the cities a really wicked problem to deal with. But as I say, because it's where the climate battle will be won or lost, we have to find ways around it and find the low-hanging fruit and explore synergies and try and resolve as much of it as possible, despite of the challenges of working within existing cities.
Excellent, great. Nuha, do you want to provide any final thoughts for us?
Sure. So I just turned off the alarm. Now, on the final thoughts, I think we brought, speaking about, for example, how do we actually strengthen early warning systems for communities in need in other parts of the world, but actually our next steps, I think, for the MENA region is actually we will be launching a regional network at the COOP 27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where we will be having a number of piloting cities within the MENA region. So hopefully we'll be able to explore this coastal kind of cities and inlands and what are the different challenges and opportunities that we might be able to explore there. But also, breaking what we call that end-to-end chain when it comes into risk warning and risk governance. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
No, that's great. That's something to look forward to. And Aline, do you want to give us your final words of wisdom?
Very briefly, I think it would be great to actually always integrate the discussion on cities and rural areas, because I think at the urbanization rate that we have, especially in the region, we need to make sure that not just the cities are livable, but we need to make sure that not more people are only coming to the cities, but the rest of the countries are also providing good spaces to live and are sustainably used. And that, yeah, we're not scared by the investment that it might take on the first sight to turn into smart cities or climate resilient cities, but that we look at the opportunities that are also quick gains, and that we look at climate financing in a more diverse manner to help incentivize that.
Perfect. I think that's a great goal and target. Well, with that, I think we can conclude our panel. I want to thank my panelists very, very much for your insights and really great comments and analysis on sort of the varied topics and queries we explored today. So thank you very much. For everyone else that's online and watching, if you notice, as I mentioned earlier, the session is really a two-parter. This is the panel. And with the panel concluding, I'm going to transition to a little bit earlier than scheduled, but transition to the final portion of the session, which is concluding the event. And so I'll invite Adil Abbas to join me. What I'd like to do first is maybe just do a quick recap on the event itself, just to kind of take an assessment of where we are and where we've been over the last couple of days, and then I'll pass it on to Adil for his thoughts on potential next steps, and then I'd be happy to close it. But first, just kind of summarizing some of the notes and observations we've had over the last couple of days. And it really started on the first day when both Paul Salem and Ayat Suleiman provided their introductory comments. And they really set the stage at the high level, emphasizing the specific or maybe unique vulnerability that the Middle East faces in terms of impacts to their human population, biodiversity, potential impacts to investments due to climate change impacts related to higher temperatures, reduced rainfall, and rising sea levels. And then really the takeaway of utilizing a green and resilient inclusive development approach to ensure quality of growth in the MENA region. And then my colleague here, Adil, talked about the roadmap itself, highlighting that MENA is one of the most climate vulnerable regions, and that climate change is specifically a threat multiplier in MENA, with a few examples. And then we really dived into the 4 transformation areas for a climate smart future that is integral to the roadmap document itself, which then laid the foundation of the panels that we explored, which is looking at food systems, water security, and resilient natural capital, energy transition and low carbon mobility, climate smart cities and resilient coastal economies, and then finally the fourth, sustainable finance for climate action. And then recognizing that the roadmap is intended to build on a strong foundation and principles for climate smart development supported by the World Bank. Our first panel, which looked at climate smart approaches to natural resource management. Some of my takeaways from that, based on what we heard, is that there's some hope that we will be able to keep the pace to mainstream natural resource management efforts as a way to combat climate change, and recognize that natural ecosystems can offer short and long-term solutions while also offering social and economic benefits. One of the panelists there also noted that water scarcity isn't just a hydrologic problem. We can leverage and use the political and economic sense, or lenses actually, to understand the role of water in the region. One of the other points raised in that first panel is that the vulnerability and adaptive capacity of different groups are actually shaped by the social norms that they experience and power inequalities. And then finally, one of the last points I want to raise from that first panel is that there is a need or desire to better utilize technology for climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts, to try to integrate those efforts into sort of a holistic view of natural resource management. Our second panel looked at strategic and optimal approaches for green investments. Some of the brief takeaways there, this idea that trying to meet emission goals in the region and to try to diversify the economies of the region are going to require very dynamic private sector engagement and also dynamic ecosystems. So not just on the investment side, but on the ecosystems themselves that can be utilized. One of the ways that was discussed is exploring carbon trading as a mechanism that could be helpful in funding different conservation projects where it's applicable, because its capacity to increase returns via essentially claimed carbon credits. Our third panel, which started earlier today or a few hours prior, which was looking at achieving economic growth through energy and transport decarbonization. Some of the takeaways there that I know that was noted is that the idea that if we want to keep pace and achieve this goal of net zero carbon by 2050, decarbonization needs to happen through regional cooperation and a whole economy approach, not individual economies. And there's opportunities when we look at things like electric mobility, that the clean energy transition does present a huge opportunity, specifically the example used was in terms of job creation. And then cities, in terms of that lens of economic growth, cities have to invest in infrastructure that encourages more dense or diverse and well-designed infrastructure that in turn can promote and encourage the use of low carbon modes of transportation. So people can feel incentivized to do more walking, biking, and utilize public transportation that are efficient and low carbon. And then one of the other points raised was on the clean energy transition, recognizing that it'll be very costly. The example was used specifically for the GCC nations, but that there's natural endowments in the region that are also conducive to renewable energy production in terms of solar and wind that also can be coupled with carbon capture and storage. And then the last point from that third panel is that there are opportunities that are significant in terms of trying to utilize regional climate finance to support nations that are trying to achieve their various renewable energy targets. And then a brief recap in the session or the panel, the final panel we just had, we overviewed some of the high-level impacts of climate change on cities and urban environments, looking at rising sea levels, temperature extremes, changes to rainfall, and then how can municipalities and urban approaches take place when we look at investing in urban agriculture and water storage systems and solar energy, etc. And to pick on Kareem's last point, cities are where climate battles will be won or lost. I think that's a great takeaway and is supported by the discussion we had. A couple other points from this final panel is that municipal climate adaptation strategies are generally underfunded and they lack adequate implementation, certainly in some places more than others. And we should seek to make agricultural systems more circular in the context of cities, exploring and looking and tapping into things like reusing waste and water. And that's one way we can improve urban food security. And then last point, just to share from our last panel, is that ownership of solutions when we talk about impacts to cities among the citizen or community level is really crucial and important to achieve success for urban adaptation and applying solutions that are climate smart. So with that, hopefully caught everyone up on what we talked about at a very high level over the last few days. So I'll pass it on to my colleague Adil Abbas to maybe talk about next steps and share some of his perspectives.
Thank you, Mohammed. Let me first start by saying thank you and thanks to all the panelists and all the organizers who have worked very hard to put these two days together. This was, in my view and in Birdbank's view, one of those series of dialogues that we would like to have, especially in the next 3 to 4 years, and especially in the lead up to COP27 in Egypt and then COP28 in UAE following year. And the reason we really want to have these dialogues is to learn and adapt how World Bank can support a low carbon and a resilient transition in MENA region. And that's really the overall objective of the roadmap that we shared yesterday. I really found some, and I couldn't follow all of the panel sessions, but I found some of the interesting discussions really interesting and fascinating, the outcomes that you have just described as well. And we would very much look forward to building more partnerships, having more dialogue, and doing technical deep dives in specific areas where we feel there's not enough data in MENA region to really advise policymakers, really advise on the next generation of investments. The intention, as if I can go back to the roadmap again, is to see what we can learn from existing knowledge and also learn from the changing economic and political and social conditions in MENA region to transform our programs, not just for the purposes of some green programs, but more changing the approach from the current climate change for the sake of climate change to a more green investments going forward at all levels, at the level of the governments, as you mentioned and reiterated, the whole of economy approach, but then at the level of all of the stakeholders, including civil society and academia as well. So really, this is one of the first of the roadmaps for 5 years, where we would hopefully deepen the dialogue in all of these sectoral areas which were discussed in the past 2 days, and move forward in collaboration with partners and stakeholders. So really like, again, the partnership with MEI that we have started on this knowledge exchange agenda, and we look forward to continuing that. We would also open up to other stakeholders and partners who would like to join us in that endeavor. And then finally, again, let me emphasize and thank all of the colleagues by name, if I can. I know I will miss few names, especially on your side, Mohammed, at MEI side. But on our side, Frederic, Selena, and other colleagues from communications and organization and development effectiveness teams who have helped work with you closely to put this together, and looking forward to more and more of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adil. I agree. I think this is meant to be a starting point, not a one and done. There's, this previews a lot of the areas we can move forward in, And I absolutely echo your sentiment. Look forward to collaboration opportunities beyond today, and very much appreciative and thankful to all the panelists and all the team behind the scenes to make this happen. The recordings, just one last sort of logistical note, the recordings for all of these panels will be available through the MEI website, linked to MEI's YouTube channel. So people are always welcome to view that again. So with that, I will call us adjourned. Thank you all for your attendance and appreciate your participation.